That night, two men left their hotel room in downtown Manhattan and took a cab to Kennedy Airport. They boarded the same plane for Chicago. The plane never reached Chicago.
All the passengers and all the crew lost their lives. In the paper, the names Robert Goodwin and Carl Blackton were included. No one knew that these two men were brothers.
In Guatemala, a simple spot of earth marks the spot where Pedro Montigo is buried. He died of a disease he never understood.
Hello, friends. The Bible tells us that man was created in the image of God, but the circumstances of life have been very different for some than for others. What bearing do these differences have on God's appraisal of the individual, especially with reference to worthiness or unworthiness of everlasting life? To present this subject, I have with me Mr. Edward Fay, Bible scholar and international lecturer, and Mr. Norman Woodworth, associate editor of the Dawn magazine.
And Mr. Russell Pollock, our moderator.
Thank you. Today, we will present action pictures of some of the different environments which are experienced by people throughout the world. Mr. Woodworth, do you have in mind what I mean by the differences of environment?
I think so, Russell. Some are born, as the saying is, with a silver spoon in their mouth. Others are born in poverty. Some are born and raised in a Christian environment. Others into an environment of ungodliness and crime.
And wouldn't you say, Ed, that God's attitude toward the individuals caught in these circumstances over which they had no control must be one of understanding, and that God is just in his judgment of the virtues and sins of everyone?
Russell, I think that is absolutely true. Certainly it must be true that the character-molding circumstances which have so much to do with determining whether one is a good man or an evil man are taken into consideration by God in passing judgment upon them.
Well, I would naturally think that myself. But before we discuss it further, let us watch the unfolding of circumstances in the cases of three individuals of three totally different environments. Perhaps then we can discuss God's viewpoint with a little more understanding.
Robert George Smith was born in Hartford, Connecticut, July 18, 1918.
Carl Roger Smith was born in Hartford, Connecticut.
Pedro Montigo was born in Guatemala, somewhere near Chichicastenango. There is no birth certificate to signify the time or place. In all likelihood, the only human being who witnessed his birth was his mother. Pedro was no one special, just another child to hang on to her back when she walked among the markets, another child to feed, another to clothe, and as soon as possible, another child to go to work when he could perform the simplest tasks in the fields. Pedro never heard of Christ. Oh, he had been told that there was a God, a terrifying God, a God who punished people if they did not mind his ways and made great sacrifices in his name. One day, Pedro tried to see the face of God. He closed his eyes and he saw a thundercloud. Again, he closed his eyes and he saw lightning. Once more, he closed his eyes and he saw a red and yellow face with horns on its head. And everything that Pedro saw filled him with terror, a terror that was to haunt and to pursue him all of his life. In the world where Pedro lived, where he grew up as a child, school bells were unknown to him. And so were books. The words that opened up new worlds were not planted in him like seeds. His mind was like a piece of earth, unkept, dry as if it had never rained. Oh, he knew that there was some kind of miraculous world beyond the city where he lived, but nothing more. He knew that there was some other kind of God. But somehow it never occurred to him that this other God had anything to do with him. His was an Indian God, a God of vengeance, a God who demanded to be paid attention to in stones. He never thought that he could talk to his God directly. He didn't think it was possible. Instead, he would talk to the witch doctors, and he would pay them a sum to talk for him to God, to get some favor from a God so poor that he had to be paid for his acts of kindness. Pedro's world was, hardly a mile long and a mile wide. And beyond that, he knew almost nothing. When Pedro Montego came into the world, he owned nothing. Years later, when he became a man, he still owned nothing he could call his own. And yet, Pedro Montego lived in the 20th century. He saw automobiles, airplanes, jets screaming across the skies. He heard radios and he saw television. And yet, Pedro lived and worked exactly as his forebears had lived and worked 300 years ago. Basically untouched by his times. Was he a good man? Was he a bad man? How can you judge? Would it be fair to judge him by Christian standards when he never knew what Christian standards were? Montego was a man. He was a man as close to being an animal as any human being can be in the 20th century. Yet, if you spoke Pedro's unusual Indian dialect, if you asked him, or any other member of his family, why he was born, or what happens to them when they die, they would stare at you with a stony stare of incomprehensibility and not know what to say.
Carl Roger Smith was barely into the world when his parents died. Deep down in his consciousness, there is a memory of an automobile ride which took him from his home to the orphanage. Also in the deep and tangled regions of his mind is the memory of another automobile ride which took him from the orphanage to live with his new parents, Mr. and Mrs. Blackton. It was some years before Carl was told that he was an orphan and that he had a brother. Once or twice he wondered what his brother was like, where he lived. But beyond that, he hardly thought of it at all. Carl Blackton was not the kind to think about such things. When Carl Blackton heard the sound of school bells, he blotted it out as he blotted out all other sounds. The sound of his mother and father fighting, sound of thousands of arguments, chastisements, accusations, misunderstandings. There was one thing that Carl Blackton wanted more and more, and that was to be alone. So he went out of his room, out of his house, out to a country path. Anything to be alone. And then Carl Blackton learned something when he was a very young man. When you were alone, there was no one to hate. There was also no one to love. When Carl Blackton became a man, people paid attention. In fact, that was one thing Carl Blackton couldn't stand, was not to be paid attention to. Some people said he was very mean that way, but then they didn't know what it was like to be humiliated as a child again and again by a drunken father. Nor did they know what it was to have a mother who didn't care, who wished she had never adopted a child and let him know it every day of his life. Carl Blackton's philosophy was simple. The grave is the end. There is no judgment of your life. Take now, for now is all there is to take. Morality, life after death, kingdom of God. These were fairy tales to him, which he kicked out of his life as he did Santa Claus and Robin Hood. Carl Blackton was a bad penny. A bad penny he invested, and it brought him almost $1 million. Nothing succeeds like success, he used to say. And debauchery was his way of life.
When Robert Smith was 13 months old, his parents were killed in an automobile accident along a Florida road. He never knew what happened until he was told years later. At that time, he was taken to an orphanage where at the age of 3, he was adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Richard Goodwin. He did not pick his foster parents. He called them Mother and Dad. They called him their son. When Bob Goodwin was still a boy, his parents told him he had a brother somewhere else in the world. Bob seized upon this thought like an explorer, dreaming of a voyage that would someday take him to a far country. Bob thought about his brother all his life and longed for the day when they would meet. When Bob Goodwin first heard the rhymes of Jack and Jill and Little Miss Muffet, he also heard the story of the Christ child born in a manger. He listened to these stories with widening eyes and took the wondrous images into his mind. He loved to hear these stories told again and again. And when he was himself a father, reading the same stories to his son, he loved them just as much as he'd loved them many years before. School bells rang in the days, and Bob Goodwin opened up his mind, his eyes, his ears, and the world flowed in as a melody and a promise of wonders to come. Words settled inside him like seeds. Words like Christ, God, love, fair play, democracy, devotion, prayer, faith. And all the world around him wanted these seeds to grow. There was a family warmth and a continuity of smiles that brightened his life in endless different ways. Trust was his foundation of security. There was a plan for growth. A plan in which all his life, his hopes, his dreams, his disappointments, could fit inside this plan. Bob Goodwin felt the world he lived in was a continuing world. Knowing that made him strong. At Kennedy International Airport, with passengers arriving from all over the world, thousands and thousands of people crossing each other by, 2 men shared a cab back to New York City. 2 men whose names were Robert Goodwin and Carl Blackton. 2 men, brothers, discovered each other after so many years. They decided to share a hotel room in Manhattan before taking the same plane back to Chicago.
You know, it's a strange thing. Looking at a brother that you've never seen before.
Yeah.
Did you ever get the full story on our real parents?
Well, I saw a picture of them when I was a kid.
Well, what'd they look like?
Seemed happy.
Well, you still have the picture?
No, I lost it somewhere.
Oh, that's too bad. I would have liked to seen them. Well, after all, they are responsible for us. They brought us into the world. They're part of us in ways we don't even know about. Body type, maybe even basic dispositions. And you know, I'll bet they had dreams for us, too.
Yeah, well, we'll never know that, will we? I mean, we've lived the kind of lives we want to lead.
Well, from what you tell me, you're very successful, Carl. I mean, all those holding companies and corporations and traveling all around the world. How many men work in your organization?
150.
150 people. You know, I've never had anybody work for me in my whole life.
You're lucky.
Yeah, well, haven't made much money either. Well, my kids had to get a scholarship to get into college. What about you, Carl? You married?
Divorced.
Sorry.
I'm not.
So, life worked out very well for you then, huh?
Yeah. I can buy just about anything I want to, within reason, of course. I figure that I could retire right now if I wanted to and live comfortably for, say, the next
500 years?
Why, you are fortunate. Oh, I've never been financially free. Do you know something, Carl? I've been a very happy man. Well, I've never done anything with life but live it. And I've never done much among men except love them.
We're different people.
Mm-hmm. You know what I was just thinking? Can you imagine what it would have been like if we'd been switched? I mean, if your foster parents had raised me and mine had raised you.
What do you mean?
Well, you'd have been more like me, and I'd have been more like you.
That night, two men left their hotel room in downtown Manhattan and took a cab to Kennedy Airport. They boarded the same plane for Chicago. The plane never reached Chicago.
All the passengers and all the crew lost their lives. In the paper, the names Robert Goodwin and Carl Blackton were included. No one knew that these two men were brothers.
Two men who came into the world so very close together. Life separated them and cast their characters into two entirely different molds.
Carl Blackton believed the grave was the end. His brother believed that there was life beyond the grave.
In Guatemala, a simple spot of earth marks the spot where Pedro Montego is buried. He died of a disease he never understood. While he lived, most of the things that happened to him he never understood. While he lived, he feared the wrath of his Indian God, and his only thought of afterlife was that he would come face to face with this punishing and very wrathful God.
What we have here are the stories of three men. From what we know of their lives, Robert Goodwin was a kind man, deeply influenced by loving parents, guided by his church and Christian upbringing. It is not difficult to understand why God would look kindly upon this good man who followed the patterns set down for him in his early childhood.
Very true, but as we know, there are millions born into the world under less favorable circumstances. What is God's viewpoint toward these people? Does he have compassion for them? Surely Carl had not the same opportunities as Bob. As Bob observed, had they been switched as children, they would have been two entirely different people. Their parents and situations would have molded them in a completely different way. How then does God look at these circumstances over which we have no control? Does he allow for them?
Yes, we must admit that the environment of millions is conducive to unrighteous living. Russell, we could say that for millions in this materialistic world, religious training is a scarce article. We might ask with equal propriety what God is doing about it.
There is still another aspect of this problem. The Bible tells us that there is no other name given under heaven amongst men whereby we can be saved except the name of Christ. All must accept Christ as their Redeemer in order to be saved. With this thought in mind, think of the millions in heathen lands, especially in the past, who never heard the name Christ. How does God view these? Are they all lost? If they are to be saved, how will their salvation be brought about?
Well, I think in the case of Pedro Montego, who never knew anything but a non-Christian form of worship, we have a special set of circumstances before us which calls for an explanation. When I say that, I have in mind the view of many that at death, one's eternal destiny is fixed, that then each individual is either found worthy of salvation or unworthy of salvation. Mr. Woodworth, I would like your comment on that point.
Well, of course, I see the dilemma. If the situation is as you have outlined, we would need to conclude that God is not just in his dealings with his creatures, that he passes judgment without taking into consideration all the circumstances involved.
However, Russell, there is much in the Bible to support the thought that man's final destiny is not fixed at death. Take the case of the Sodomites, for example. These fit fairly well into the picture presented to us of the child born into the debauchery of a poor family in the slums of almost any of our large cities. Like the heathen, they had never heard of Christ, for Christ had not yet come.
But just how do the experiences of the Sodomites help us out of the dilemma?
Well, as you know, they died in their sin and debauchery. Yet Jesus, more than 3,000 years later, said that it would be more favorable for the Sodomites in the day of judgment than it would be for certain cities who rejected him, despite the miracles he performed in their midst.
That, it seems to me, calls for an explanation of just what constitutes the day of judgment. Ed, I would like to have you tell us your opinion on that.
Well, actually, the day of judgment is an entire age in the plan of God. It is not a 24-hour day devoted merely to the passing of sentence upon saint and sinner. It is a time when God's kingdom will be established on earth, and according to Isaiah 26:9, it's a time when people will learn righteousness. For countless millions, this will offer them their first opportunity to know Christ and to accept him.
Actually, Russell, the faithful followers of Jesus during this age will not appear for judgment in the future judgment day at all. In John 5, verse 24, Jesus gives us this information. The Apostle Paul, he observed that they will be associated with Jesus in judging the unbelieving world. And Jesus tells us that these unbelievers will be brought forth from death in what he calls a resurrection by judgment. They will be given an opportunity to live forever on the earth.
Now, let me get this straight. From what you say, God will extend mercy to sinners in the judgment day. Is that right?
The Apostle Paul, speaking of the Israelites who had rejected Jesus at the time of the first advent, says that God had counted them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon them. And he also assures us that they all will have the opportunity of life during the judgment day.
One important point we must keep in mind when considering this scriptural viewpoint of the judgment day is that all judgment by the Lord will be rendered upon the basis of his ability to read the heart condition of each individual. Between the extremes of circumstances which mold people's thoughts and lives, as we have seen these illustrated, are thousands of circumstances less extreme. We cannot understand why some in the same family turn out to be good people and others do not, but God knows why, and the Bible clearly teaches that he will deal with them and bless them in keeping with his exact justice and his boundless love. Russell, what we have had time merely to state briefly is all covered in detail in the little book entitled The Day of Judgment.
Friends, we want to send you a free copy of this satisfying presentation of the Bible's teaching on the Day of Judgment. Actually, there is more than one judgment day in the plan of God, but the little book will tell you about these, and you will find out that the great creator of the universe is just the kind of a loving God that you have always wanted him to be.
To view the booklet online, visit www.dawnbible.com, or to receive a hard copy of the booklet by mail, send us your name and postal mailing address and ask for the booklet by name. The title of the booklet for this program is The Day of Judgment. Send an email to dawnbible@aol.com. The booklet will be mailed to you free and without obligation. And now, goodbye, and may God bless you.